I'm going to talk to Dick in a third session here. Just give it over to him. So, yeah. Okay, I think we will get started. Thank you so much for being here. It's great to be with you. Thank you, Pastor Roy, for inviting me to be a part of the 75th anniversary. For those of you who don't know me or haven't seen me in a long while, my name is Dale Soden, and I've been a member of St. Mark's since 1985. So, Newcomer. Exactly. Exactly. Newcomer.
You're a baby.
And 25 years ago, worked with Dave Tanner, who many of you know, and produced that video that some of you have seen about 50th anniversary, which some of you, including Carolyn, are part of that, or interviewed in that. And so it's fun to be back 25 years later. I can't believe it has been 25 years since the 50th. Seems really like yesterday. But I want to begin just briefly by reminding us that St. Mark's, I think, is the exception rather than the rule as it relates to just being a thriving congregation. The rule right now is that most congregations don't last 75 years, let alone thrive during the course of those 75 years ago. Many years ago, I wrote a biography of a pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Seattle, and that church was the most influential Protestant church in many ways in the Pacific Northwest during the first half of the 20th century, and in fact was the largest church by membership with close to 10,000 members at its height in the country, largest Presbyterian church in the country. It no longer exists. And so it puts in perspective the fact that these things, when I say things, these congregations, these communities that form around belief in Jesus Christ are fragile. And again, I think you all, and many of you have been a large part, many of you sitting in this room, a large part of the fact that this is an exception rather than the rule. So what I want to do today is to give a big picture. I'll talk about that in just a minute, but I have to say something about the Seattle Mariners.
Speaking of miracles.
I'm sort of, many of you are. There's just a surreal experience over the weekend, and particularly yesterday. I like to, people will listen to me probably over a beer or two talk about baseball as the most Lutheran of all sports, and I say that tongue-in-cheek in a way, but I'm quite serious about it in the sense that I think as Protestant expressions go, it's one that deals as seriously with failure as any Protestant expression. We enter, and almost immediately we confess our sin and failure, and thanks for the grace that we've received. But baseball is replete with failure generally. It is a hard sport, and of course the Mariners have epitomized failure over my adult lifetime. It's really been 25 years, 21 since we've gotten to the playoffs, but just that a whole generation of hope and yet failure, and yet there were moments yesterday. I don't know if you were watching, but when J.P. Crawford's bloop double scored 3 runs that allowed them to tie that. If that wasn't an unmerited gift of grace, thinking about Edwin's sermon this morning, if that was about as undeserved, as you possibly could have, and you couple that with the fact that see, that's not Lutheran. Don't go down that path. that was as well as just overcoming a 7-run deficit. I mean, there's no one that expected that to happen. So miracles do happen, and happened before our eyes yesterday. And who knows? Maybe we will kick the hated Astros over the next week. But I was just still. Quite an experience yesterday for someone who spends way too much time reading, thinking about the Seattle Mariners. But in any event, the question really is, why has St. Mark's flourished? Why have we done something here that many other congregations have tried and failed at? And that's really what I want to try to talk about as much as anything. And this morning, really, this is a big picture lecture, if you will, or presentation. What we're going to do in the next session, and several of people I've asked to come next week and be interviewed about their experiences here are here. Dick and Patty, Elaine, we're going to have Kate Cadlick here, and I'm still going to have Dan Kimberly, but Dan can come next week and he'll be with us the following session. But the idea is for me next week to interview these people and to have them share and talk about their experience here at St. Mark's. In the third session, we're going to focus primarily on Dick's ministry, since that's almost half of the history of the congregation. Dick will be here, and we'll spend the hour together interviewing one another, and then we'll finish it up with a session on sort of what have we learned about. I'll speak up a little bit louder, I can tell. What have we learned in this dive into St. Mark's history, and what might that mean for the future of St. Mark's? So that's the overall plan. But today is a kind of big picture with the focus on as Pastor Lori said in the introduction, some of the contexts that have been important for shaping the life of St. Mark's, but also a kind of DNA. What is it that from our earliest beginnings, in my opinion, has shaped the direction of St. Mark's? Where does it fit in the overall story of Lutheranism in North America? Through this story is always an attention to the incredible lay people. Again, many of you are here who have given thousands and thousands of hours to St. Mark's in various forms of ministry. And the pastoral leadership that's been with Kate and Lori and Edwin here as representatives, really, of a history of pastoral leadership that's been important for St. Mark's. But I would say that there are 4 areas that I want to focus on that I think have been very important, and that is first of all the importance of worship and the idea of what happens every Sunday morning out here. That's been a critical part of the history of this place. What we see are pastors who give leadership, have given leadership for 75 years in terms of a Lutheran tradition. And not every Lutheran church stays at some level within that tradition. And so I think we've been blessed with people who have been trained in biblical studies and church history and Lutheran theology. And of course, a part of that has been at St. Mark's in an outsized emphasis on music and the arts. And I want to talk about that today as being such an important part of the history of St. Mark's. The second area would be education. We have, from the very beginning, as many of you know, but if you don't, from the very beginning, education has been a very important part of the experience of at St. Mark's, whether that's in the form of the Sunday school. We saw that this morning in terms of the passing of Bibles to 3rd graders. And I love, Lori, what you said about how to think even beginning at the 3rd grade. I've got a 3rd grade grandson, and I was thinking about how he might receive all of that. But I love just the liturgy of passing on the Bible in the context of the church, and the encouragement to read that Bible, to think about it, to write about it, to share all of that's been an important part. Vacation Bible School, adult forums, there are myriad ways in which education has been a part of confirmation, obviously. Thirdly, and again, this wouldn't distinguish St. Mark's, but we talked a little bit about the ways in which we have supported one another to develop a sense of community within St. Mark's. And we see that every Sunday in terms of, most notably, the praying for individual members as a part of our worship experience, but the myriad ways, again, in which we have come together to support one another, to get to know one another, to have fun with one another. I've had a running debate on politics with Dean Morehouse for as long as I can remember, and we're still friends with one another, and that's largely because of the church context that we have been in. And then finally, the ways in which St. Mark's has done, which again, just as I was listening to the worship again, just reminded myself of so many of these things. What are you going to do with the grace that's been given to you? How do you witness and share that grace with others? And that obviously has been an important part of St. Mark's ministry through the years in terms of the socials, the various social ministries that this congregation has been a part of. Well, again, Pastor Lori said that I would talk a little bit about context, various contexts. Historians love context. What's the environment in which we work and live in? And so I'm going to talk briefly about some of these before then circling back to these four areas and highlighting some things within those four areas. But I think one of the most important, if not the most important context for St. Mark's in terms of understanding our DNA or how it is that we have taken this journey and this path and the direction that we have is to understand that we were a church within the Augustana Synod of the Lutheran Church. Now, we haven't talked a lot, at least in my mind, over the last couple of decades about what it has meant to be historically a church within the Swedish part of the Lutheran Church. But as I was preparing for this and going back over the early pastors and church records, it became clear that being an Augustana church was a critical part of how people who gathered at St. Mark's began to think about themselves. Now, you probably know that out of the Protestant Reformation, that Lutherans largely organized themselves around ethnic groups. And so whether it's, in this case, Swedish or Norwegians or Danes or Finns or Germans, those would be the principal groups that organized themselves after the 16th century and into the 18th, 19th century. And then, of course, as they emigrated to the United States, maintained those ethnic identities, still do to a certain extent, but we have seen within our own, certainly my lifetime, the fragmenting, the diminishment, and that's a natural thing to have happen. Generations removed, traditions, let's say, diminished to a certain extent, and what we've seen, obviously, in our own congregation here is a mix now of people both in other Lutheran synods and Lutheran identities. I did not grow up as an ethnic Lutheran. My parents went to a Lutheran church because it was the closest to their house, and they were late to the Presbyterian church that they were intending to go to. But such is the way things can turn on a dime. But in any event, as a student at Pacific Lutheran University in the late 60s and early 70s, I became much more aware of the ethnic identities of Lutherans. Well, in any event, so what does it mean to be in the Augustana tradition? And that's a complicated story in many respects, and you can get lost in the weeds relative to the specifics of the Augustana Synod in relationship to others. But I would say this, that unlike the Missouri Synod, which has been the most dedicated to maintaining its own identity apart from other Lutheran bodies, believing that doctrinally that it couldn't compromise on a number of issues with other Lutheran bodies. The Augustana Synod was at the forefront of encouraging the people to come, Lutherans to come together to put aside many of their differences that had been a part of their development over the previous centuries, and really had it wasn't, I wouldn't call it ecumenical in the way in which we think about ecumenism, meaning let's get Catholics together and Protestants together, and people from varying sects within the Christian family. But I would say it was more ecumenical in the sense of it's important to come together, and I think that was an important part of St. Mark's from the beginning. That St. Mark's never had a history of being a fundamentalist Lutheran church or an overly pious Lutheran church. You could use those terms to describe some aspects of Lutheranism in different parts of the country, but that was not what really marked the community at St. Mark's. And from the beginning, education was important, music was important, and serving the community was important. So I would say, again, this DNA, this part of who we are from the very beginning, has had a kind of inclusive character to it. Now we will see it develop that in the way that it becomes even a part of our mission statement, but I would say the impulse for inclusivity rather than exclusivity has been an important part of St. Mark's from the very beginning. Now, a second context is the fact that we exist in Spokane. Now, obviously, it's 1947 that we celebrate as the beginning, and there are some parts to our history that precede that. But Spokane, after the end of the Second World War, was a community that was gradually growing. It wasn't rapidly growing. Spokane did not have the kind of war industry, it had some, but did not have the war industry that Seattle had, or Portland had, or Tacoma had, that really spurred two things. One, a general growth, but also a more diverse racial community. Those communities really developed, again, some of their racial identities, or a critical mass, particularly of African Americans, largely because of the employment that was available during the Second World War, and African Americans gravitated to fill those jobs at Boeing and Kaiser and whatnot, where again we just didn't have it. So it was primarily still is primarily a comparatively white community, and that I wouldn't say, I mean, in a kind of general sense, it shaped St. Mark's just as it did other congregations within the Spokane world. But we should keep in mind that the commitment to being a white community is a complex story, and one that we're still unraveling to this day. And it's marked in large part by an awareness that throughout the city in the early part of the 20th century, but even in the early 1940s, that real estate was platted with specifically the idea of maintaining an all-white community in certain parts of the city. And so I'm not sure where the platting is for this. It's probably worth investigating at some level, who owned this plat that we're on right now, and what kind of covenant, if any, existed. We just found out just very recently that Whitworth had platted land to sell where the new Rockwood's North retirement complex is, and I think all of those had restrictive racial language attached to that. there were certain parts of the South Hill that had that language attached to that. Now, I think it's just it's a reality that existed in our history, one that probably most of the people who were gathering at St. Mark's in 1947 weren't really aware of, but it was a part of the context, the racial context that existed within Spokane during the post-war period. Now, the other thing about that context is that the Pacific Northwest was then and still is the least churched region of the country. So we're at some level far away from the home office. Now, what do I mean by home office? Mostly in for Lutherans, the upper Midwest, and we have some Scandinavians who have migrated to Ballard and Seattle, and there's a kind of pocket of Lutheranism, as many of you know, in Seattle. But for the most part, again, religion in the Pacific Northwest is something that people had to self-consciously do instead of it being just a part of the air in which one breathed. So some of you know I taught for 5 years in Oklahoma, and that was such a radically different environment for religion than the Pacific Northwest was. I mean, everyone went to not just church on Sunday, but they didn't have basically school events on Wednesday because that was a church night, and so you didn't have to think too much about going to church in Oklahoma. And when I say that, I don't mean to make it seem like you're just robotic, but it was just so much a part of the culture. Whereas context in the Northwest is, as many of you know, different. And I'm sure you have lots of friends who are not Christian, lots of friends who don't go to church. And so then, from the beginning, the idea that, establishing a church, being a part of a church community was a self-conscious decision on the part of yourself and your families. Now, the one other, to me, interesting context that it's hard to know exactly what kind of impact that it had on St. Mark's would be just the fact that in 1947, we are in the midst of the Cold War, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Now, what historians have identified is that in part this is sort of counter to what I just said as far as the least church region of the country, but there was definitely an impulse in the country as a whole to demonstrate that we were a Christian nation in the face of godless, atheistic communism. And so there was a kind of let's say, an impetus for more church building, in the years after the Second World War. And at some level, St. Mark's might be considered as a part of that impulse that was affected by the Cold War overall. So what I want to just suggest is that there's a Lutheran context, there's a local context, and there's a national context that all had probably some importance. Of those three, I would still say the Augustana context is the most important for us to recognize. Okay, so the origin of the congregation dates back to at least the beginning efforts to organize the congregation is in December 1945, which is just 4 months after the end of the Second World War. There was a parish worker assigned by the Augustana Synod to start surveying homes in this particular area, a woman by the name of Martha Folker. And soon after that, the Augustana Church identified or assigned Reverend H.J. Holkinson to be and he was the regional director of the Augustana Church, to conduct services in the Masonic Temple, across, that still exists here across the street on Grand. Shortly thereafter, Holkinson formed a Sunday school. In a matter of weeks, an invitation went out to women to meet, interested, and as well as interested men to meet shortly thereafter. And soon to follow was a Luther League. So the initial strategy was to meet the needs of families who had small kids, let's gather around education, let's gather around Luther League, and if you can get the kids at some level, that will make it easier to form a congregation. So in June 1946, Luther Livingston was called out of the Augustana Synod, Rock Island Seminary, which was the seminary that influenced so many of the pastors, the early pastors of this church. And in January 1947, St. Mark's was formally organized, 180 members, 123 of these were confirmed adults. And that began a process by which to now build the building. And Frank Payne, almost from the get-go, but very involved in all of that. But beginning in the 50s, 1950, a cornerstone was laid for the first unit of the new building. And it really was in three, correct me if I'm wrong here, Frank, I know that you know this better than I, but this part of the facility was first built. It was followed by the sanctuary, and then in 1986, the fellowship hall. But and I'll say more about the architecture of the church in a minute, because I think that's such an interesting part of St. Mark's history. But in any event, so it's in the 1950s that we really start growing. There's a kind of physical presence here that's important for the future of the congregation. Livingston was here for 6 years. He was followed by, and I'm just going to run through these names, not to really give you a lot of names to remember. Some of you might remember some of these people, but to give you a sense of the importance of the Augustana Synod, because they're all Augustana pastors, and they're all Rock Island Seminary pastors. So their influence in kind of shaping, the culture, I think, can't be overstated in this regard. So he was followed by Willis Erickson for 6 years, 1959 for 4 years. Irvin Malm served the congregation. Earl Sackerson came in 1963, was here from 1968. All of these are Rock Island Seminary trained pastors. The first pastor not from Rock Island was a man named Arthur Osmundson, who went to Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, which is down in Berkeley. It's interesting to me whether this had any relationship to it or not, but he came in 1968, which at that point, and many of you know American history well enough or lived through the late 60s to recognize that there's a lot of social upheaval that's going on. And it's not just civil rights movement, it's not just the Vietnam War, but the whole notion of change was in the air. And PLTS, Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, saw itself more on the cutting edge of change within the church than many of the other seminaries. Partly, I know that I've served on the board for PLTS for like 8 years and got familiar with their history and whatnot. But he came, and it's what I discovered was kind of fun in the sense that there was a 1969 Spokane newspaper article that described Reverend Osmundson's frequent portrayal of biblical characters from the pulpit. During one Lenten season, the paper noted he portrayed in succession Peter, Judas, Herod, Caiaphas, and Pilate. Now apparently, maybe some of you know this, but the work was kind of stimulated. He had an interest in drama, and his wife Jo had a great facility for costumes and makeup. And apparently, I still find this mind-blowing. Her preparation took 2 to 3 hours to help Pastor Osmundson assume the character. So, in any event, I don't know if Pastor Osmundson was too much for St. Mark's, because the next pastor, Ernie Peel, who served from 1974 to 81, was another Augustana pastor. So there might have been. We've seen the California influence. And I'd like to go back to Rock Island. But in any event, he was followed by Denny Rodin, and then Dick Finch came in 1985, and he was trained at Wartburg Seminary, which was American Lutheran Church ALC seminary, and was here for over 30 years before retiring in 2015. Now, I think we'll say a couple more things before talking more about the building itself and the notion of worship and music as particularly expressed in the arts. But with Dick, what we now see is the addition of co-pastors that brought all different types of gifts and strengths to this place, and it made a huge difference in terms of continuing to build the congregation and to extend itself. So most of you know these names, but Steve Ringo and Tim Tostengard and Eric Dull and Edwin. But what I want to point to is the presence of female pastoral leadership, and this is a huge, in my opinion, is a huge deal as it relates to the history of St. Mark's. So whether it's Kay Tostengard or Beth Jarrett or Susan Briel or again Pastor Cade, Pastor Lori, I don't think one can overstate the importance in our congregational history of the development of a culture where both men and women would see females in the highest positions of leadership within the church. And I, as a daughter that I had grown up in this church, I think it was very important for her to again experience what the Lutheran Church had come to believe and endorse as far as women within the church. And that, let me say more about this, but that the whole issue of, as you surely know, the whole issue of gender within the church, sexual orientation, has been, a major issue of division within the church. And St. Mark's largely followed, the national Lutheran leadership here. We started ordaining women in 1970 within the Lutheran Church, but those decisions along that line have been, in my mind, central to what began to define the nature of St. Mark's. Going through various annual reports, I came across one of Dick Finch's efforts to put into words what he did during the course of the year. Now, Dick, as you know, is a person of a few words as it came to describing what he was doing, or I think he looked at those annual reports with a good deal of skepticism. But I wrote this one. This is in 2006, 2007, and I think it does say a lot about not just Dick's ministry, but the ministry of pastors throughout the decades. He wrote, okay, how do I report on my work for the year? In many ways, it was the same as it has always been. Presiding at weddings, funerals, and baptisms, sharing sadness and happiness of life transitions with congregational members, counseling, visiting, organizing, studying, preaching, planning, laughing, and crying with you, praying for you, blessing the animals, and sometimes houses. The same thing now that I've done for 35 years. And I liked it just in general as a kind of succinct sense of a lot of what goes into the complexity of pastoral care and leadership, within a congregation like St. Mark's, and we should, I think, as lay people, be eternally grateful for all of that. A word about theology, and again, it was love the service that we had. There's so much that could be commented on, but I think for me, it was again an example of what I've experienced over the years, and that was a testimony to the power of Lutheran ideas, Lutheran theology as embodied within the worship service itself. To me, and I'm not an expert in this by any means, but Lutheran theology is grounded on on Scripture alone, faith alone, grace alone, and we saw evidence of that in the sermon. We saw evidence of that in terms of passing on of Scripture, and of course the message of grace is underlying all of what goes on in that place, and that to me has been a great tradition through the 75 years that have been here. I want to talk just a little bit more in a few minutes about liturgy, but let me say a few things about music and the visual arts, because while those Lutheran ideas as embodied within the liturgy are so important to our experience here at St. Mark's, I would say what we have created here over the 75 years in terms of an architecture, the visual arts, the musical arts, is quite unusual. I mean, if you start going around to other Lutheran churches within the community, you just won't find the same dedication. And to me, all of that fits with what we've been about from the beginning. From the beginning, St. Mark's was known for its choir. The first director was Orville Westberg, good Swede, and very first year of St. Mark's existence, he organized the choir, entered it into, I guess, the choir category of the Spokane Music Festival, and we won first place. So, been there, done that, I guess. But shortly thereafter, a person who many of you remember and know well, Byron Swanson, succeeded Westberg, and he had a great influence over the music of the church. In 1971, Jan Praxel loves talking about this, I know, but we performed the rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar, and Button was a star of that, and packed this place, as it related to, again, the professionalism by which Bud and others performed that rock opera. But the musical history of St. Mark's features really an all-star lineup. I'm sure I'm going to forget people here, but Ann Fennessy and Evelyn Krager and Christopher Trussell and Debbie Hansen and Dory Swanson and Carol Miyamoto, Carolyn Payne, Dan Keverly. It's quite amazing. And then even within young people, Ev Nyholm and her work with children's choirs, and more recently Ann Brueggemeyer Benson, played major roles in making this particular aspect of St. Mark's be something that's unusually good, unusually distinctive. The organ, it's hard to go into the sanctuary and not see the dominance still of the organ today, even if we don't play it as much as we once did. But the original one built in '64, the current one dedicated in 1997. Had some amazing concerts here, and again, we committed ourselves to the organ as an instrument of worship that has been significant. The architecture, I've mentioned that, but I wanted to say a bit more about it, because to me it's so much a part of the space in which we inhabit, and the Lutheran liturgy is, in my mind, is designed to take you out of one space, meaning that kind of secular world space, and put you into a different space altogether and help you encounter, not just through the words that you hear, but the things that you see and the environment that's around you in a way that helps, again, give meaning to the fact that when we're saying go out and serve others or live your vocation or whatever, we're leaving one space and going out into another. So I found this description, or this was an interview of the early architect. He said, extremely modern churches now don't have the suggestion of religion to most people. And that is so true. I mean, most of the big churches in town, right, are big box churches. you know, they're warehouse churches, possibly evoke religious symbolism to a certain extent. In another generation, perhaps their associations will change. But in the meantime, you have to give them something familiar. So I also found this interesting. Something familiar in this case is the suggestion of the Ogevall arch, the modified Swedish arch. And again, Frank can speak to this. And what are commonly known as ecclesiastical colors, a wood violet shade on the rafters and pale lavender on the larger areas. However, the more subdued tones are accented with bright Swedish blues and a shade called pomegranate. The choice of colors for the interior is based on the theory that in everyday life, people are constantly surrounded by bright colors, so it's unnatural to move into a monotone setting to worship. The most ornate part of the extremely simple edifice is the carved wooden door that we still walk through, adorned with, if you look at that, Scandinavian symbols. Barb Philo has done a great job, Barb's here, of describing the visual arts at St. Mark's. And again, I encourage myself, all of you, to be attentive to, you know, the visual art that is a part of this experience here. She said, we're reminded of the great works of art from the Middle Ages. So we're stepping out of 21st century America and we're entering into hints of the Middle Ages, the Gothic ages itself. The primary purpose was to glorify God. The Celtic metalwork dominated the art of the Middle Ages of Northern Europe. A-frame structure is an interpretation of an ancient form of shelter specific to Northern Europe, creating a perfect setting for a collection of neo-medieval artworks. Harold Bellai's, really one of the most famous and well-accomplished artists in all of Spokane, has had an imprint on this church. He wrote, the pulpit lectern is a highly stylized bird form often used for this purpose. The baptismal font is an interpretation of the descending dove form. Both eagle and dove were common motif symbols in the medieval period, readily understood by the masses. So again, we've designed this to help us sort of move from one space into another. The clear glass of the decanter and the chalice meant to symbolize the importance of the contents, spirit, rather than the superficial exterior of the vessel. So we're meant to see particularly the wine within the vessel itself. The stained glass took on the role of major fine art. I think I'm just plagiarizing from Barb here. As the light of Christ passes through the glass without breaking the glass, it changes into myriad of colors as it reflected outward. Just as the human spirit, when touched by Christ, is changed, but not broken, and reflects the love of Christ in words and deeds. The windows created by Mark Goldsrud for St. Mark's, more contemporary in design. Goldsrud wrote, line and color suggestive of God's gift of creation spill across the architectural barriers, treating all the windows as one continuous canvas, unifying the space and those within. And then it's the spectacular painting that we have on the back. In the late 90s, Stephen Rue was commissioned to paint a striking mural upstairs at the back of the sanctuary entitled Resurrection. Was another theme of importance to the medieval church. Colors are bright and vivid, symbolizing not only the amazing spectacle of the scene, but also to emanate the joy and reverence that comes along with it. The most significant figure, Christ. He is large and central in the mural. The sun behind his head, acting as a halo, announces him as Lord. His outstretched arms and outsized hands symbolize his resurrection. The large hands engulf us in loving embrace, reminding us that we are always loved through him, and that he knows and understands our every pain. As we leave communion or exit the sanctuary, it is this type of embrace that is to remind us that our God is one who walks among us. Whenever we fall, his large hands will always be near to lift us up again. Okay, we're about out of time. I have a few more things that I will save for the next time we gather. A little introduction to our panelists, but we'll just touch on the importance of education, again, building community within ourselves, and the social service commitment that we've had at St. Mark's. But let me see in a couple minutes that we have left if any of you have any question or comment about what I've said. Yeah.
The importance of language when you were talking about going from a one pastor to a multi-pastor church.
Mm-hmm.
You use the term co-pastor, and that's very much the feeling here. I come out of a different tradition, out of a pastoral staff, and so many places it's senior pastor, associate pastor, assistant pastor.
Mm-hmm.
And here, yes, Lori is the lead pastor, Eric was the lead pastor, but there's very much a feeling of teamwork and that, I don't know, I want to use the word equals, but still, that was a very important part to me to come here and see how the staff works.
Yeah, no, thank you for that comment. I agree, and it's not a small thing,
Mhm.
and yeah.
And I think that was very much Dick's intention from what I hear about it.
Yeah, that was very
Cool.
much Pastor Finch.
Yeah.
It was very much him, and he was very clear all the time that this was, we're no one's above anyone, we are equal, and this is how we're gonna be.
Elaine?
That's what I was going to say.
Okay.
That was Pastor Finch,
Yeah.
and there was no
Yeah.
senior or that. Everybody was equal.
And I have a,
Yeah.
also I think there is a real openness about utilizing whoever there is, who could give some kind of real, the Holy Spirit and God
Mm-hmm.
to us, just like John Scherer.
Yeah.
When we came in, he was not a regular pastor, but he was as important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, thanks for mentioning. I was going to mention John, and some of you. It's been a while since John's been here, but John's still, I think he's in the 80s, and he's still working in Poland. I have a good friend who sits in on his seminars. But John was a gifted teacher, vibrant personality. But you're exactly right. I mean, the ability to kind of use people in varying ways. So
we had Jaime, who
Yeah.
brought the Hispanic
yeah,
piece.
yes,
That's right.
yeah, and
Little spots of people.
Sammy, yeah. No, there's
That's right.
there's a lot of people, and a lot of good memories of people, and many. And I think the one thing I would say, St. Mark's, for its all these pastoral calls, and I'm looking at
John Olson.
several of you.
John Olson was really.
Yeah, well, what I want to say, Carolyn, is it's the calling of people in this community. It's yourselves, Frank and Carolyn, and Pat and Elaine, and the list goes on and on. Lay people who have contributed mightily, and without the combination of lay people, if you just let the pastor do it, is not going to happen. So I have a hard time kind of, let's say, identifying that or giving credit where credit should be due. But I just think that's just a critical part of St. Mark's history.
It's kind of like cooking, and you add the spices. We've added people that have brought their special things. Food is always important, right?
Yeah.
But the idea that people have periodically been called either formally or informally to add their particular little
Yeah.
spice to the flavor that has filled in the vision that Dick had
Yeah.
for how we can live together.
And I'm hoping that next Sunday will be more of an emphasis on that. We'll see from people, not me talking about it, but just people sharing a bit of their own experiences. And I think the goal would be just that, to appreciate the spice that people have brought, the commitments that they've made, you know, it gets easier to kind of focus on the pastors, and that's obviously important, but to neglect you all, you know, would be a serious oversight, so.
Well, and at the base of all of that, and I'm trying to remember his name, but we had a real academic theologian, and I can't remember, it was a real tall guy, and he would preach, and it was like really thought-provoking, and I think that we always kept that in there.
Yeah, well, I don't know if that was Neil Buckaloo, or,
It was, you know,
yeah. Well, listen, thanks for being here, and,
it was in the late 70s.
go Mariners.
I'll get through.